Hey, Catalyst community, we just finished an interview with the Professor Timothy Noakes out of Cape Town, South Africa. You know the name, he's been on the cutting edge, some might say the bleeding edge, of so many breakthroughs over the years, from central governor theory to heart disease to hyponatremia and what we're doing with how much we drink in marathons and Ironmans and that kind of stuff. Fascinating stuff, absolutely controversial, but you're gonna love this interview. So, as always, this is the unedited video version of an episode of the Catalyst Health, Wellness, and Performance Coaching podcast that'll hit in a few weeks. But we always like to get these out ASAP to our viewers here on the YouTube coaching channel. So if you're not a subscriber yet, it's a great way to tell us you like what we're doing. Just hit that button. So enjoy the interview and let's go be a catalyst. Big pleasure today to welcome Professor Timothy Noakes to the show. Thanks for joining us. This is exciting.
Well, it's my privilege. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Your background, I mean, it would be hard to identify somebody who has been out front on so many issues. You're when you look at your background prior to all these, multiple degrees, including an MBA, published over 750 scientific books and articles, cited 19,000 plus times in the scientific literature. Professor Noakes, so many things. You just go through the list and we'll hit them all. Law of running in 86 that opened the door to some things. The hyponatremia insights, central governor theory, now the high fat, low carb dietary guidelines. What makes you tick? Like, where's all this coming from?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that I'm driven to the truth. I like to understand how things work. And when I'm not told how they work, or when it becomes obvious to me that the explanation is wrong, then I start to dig. I kind of have a premonition of what's correct and what's not true. And then I just become driven day and night to find out what the real truth is. And it's a problem. It's a real problem because so much of what we taught today is wrong. It's clearly wrong. And if you kind of get out of the mainstream, you're going to you expose yourself to real trouble, which obviously I've done on occasion. But it's in my nature, and I think it's my father was pretty much the same. I think it's pretty genetic, I suspect.
Let's talk about that. As the young Timothy Noakes, do you think your parents, your teachers, some of those folks, they looked at you and said, "Oh, here it comes! Like, this guy's coming down the path. Things are going to be happening," or is it something that you got through med school and down the road things started to come together?
I think you're right. I was a very shy child.
Okay.
I had a very dominant father, and he's a fantastic man. I mean, I just wouldn't have changed him for anyone. But he was very dominant, and he was kind of from the Victorian era, and children were they were seen and not heard, sort of thing, and you had to get on with it. And so it was a big fight for me to get recognition and to be not accepted. My father accepted me, but to be noticed or acknowledged, it took a lot of effort because he was an icon, a giant icon in his field. And so I was very shy. And then I went to medical school. Sorry, let me say I went to America on an exchange program, and I went to Los Angeles, California. And that was a defining year for me because I came from the small sort of insular little city in Cape Town, and it was very backward. And I was thrust into Los Angeles, and it was just amazing. It was the most fantastic year. And I think that opened my eyes to a completely different way of thinking. So I think that being exposed to America in the 1960s, when America was just a fabulous place, and I think that had a huge impact on me. And I thought, there is something bigger. And then what happened was Professor Christian Barnard performed the first human heart transplant in Cape Town at my university, or what would become my university. And that inspired me because I thought, how did this guy become so successful and do something and beat the rest of the world? Yeah. So he was special. And I think that kind of said, well, you can make a contribution, you can make a difference.
How did you end up in LA in the early 60s? What was the precursor for this?
It's a program called the American Field Service. It was started at the end of the First World War. The American Field Service was an ambulance service in the trenches and in the Somme, etc. And after the end of the First World War, they decided how could they help make a better world. And they said what they could do would bring children from all over the world to America for exposure to a one-year experience in America. And that was the program. So I was just fortunate to be on that program. It was a very active program at the time. And it was just unbelievable. It was just a fantastic year for me.
And you were probably 18, 20?
Yeah, I was 17 and a half, 18. That's
17.
right. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. That's a long way from home, my friend. Um, so you mentioned the controversy. It follows you everywhere. Nobody has read up on Professor Noakes without knowing what's going on here. Clearly, about a big part of that is your willingness to be out front. That I'm going to say desire, not even willingness. Have the constant critiques helped fine tune your thoughts and how you've pulled this stuff together, or does it just become white noise for you at some point?
No, I mean, I'm actually very sensitive to criticism. You know, that's interesting. And I always look at it and I say, right, has this person got a point of view? Are they correct? And then I decide on that. And if they are correct, I'll take it and say, right, I've got to change. And I think that's the reality. It's no point defending what's untrue. That's not going to help you. So if you're wrong, you better explain it. I mean, as I was wrong on the high carbohydrate diet, it was just a matter of I couldn't sustain that. And because I knew it was harming people. Let me just tell you another little story, which probably you don't know. But so I went into research in 1976.
Okay.
And my professor at that time, I was running marathons. And so I was interested in marathons. And the professor who I went to study with, just by chance, had written a letter in the New England Journal of Medicine saying that people dying of heart attacks in marathons in South Africa, and that disproved a thing called the Basler hypothesis.
Yeah.
Dr. Basler was a fantastic, lovely guy, and he was a pathologist in California, and he said the following: because it's never been documented that a marathon runner has died of coronary artery disease. Sorry, can I just turn that off?
Sure.
Because it's never been found that a marathon runner has died of coronary artery disease, marathon runners are immune to heart disease. And all you have to do is finish one marathon, you see. And he had then come forward and said he'd actually found some people who'd had heart attacks. And he wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine. And Basler wrote back and said, no, where's the data? Where's the autopsy, you see? And he said, oh, there was no autopsy. He said, well, then you haven't disproved the hypothesis. So when I went to work with Lionel Opie in his laboratory, January 1976.
So you're about 28 at this point, 27.
Yeah, that's right. So then I started looking at marathon runners, and whenever it was reported in South Africa that a marathon runner had died, I would fly to where the autopsy had been done, and I'd bring the heart back to Cape Town, and we'd examine it.
Wow.
And we hadn't found any by the time of the New York City Marathon, 1976. November 1976 was the first time the New York City Marathon went through the 6 boroughs. And there was a medical conference. And I told Lionel, I'm going to that medical conference, my professor. And he said, that's fine, but what you must do is take your slides, because we collected slides of people, sure, marathon runners had heart attacks, but we hadn't got the autopsy evidence yet. So I went, he said, you're going to go to the organizer and you're going to tell him that Lionel Opie says you must be allowed to speak. So I went to the organizer, a chap called Paul Milvey. And I said, Paul, my professor says you've got to allow me to speak because Basler's speaking. You've got to have the contrary argument, you see. So he said, no problem. So
he was loving that.
Program. So I got to speak in the lunch break or something. And it was so funny because there was very many angry people there because we'd all run the marathon and we were all thinking it was the answer. And so eventually we disproved about 2 years later, we finally found a marathon runner with heart disease, and we reported in the New England Journal of Medicine. So it was kind of, I just was facing the truth, and it didn't matter that the people would be angry with me and that they'd be disappointed. But I just had to tell them what we'd found. So that's always been my attitude.
And how do you balance that? I'm thinking, forget the detail stuff, just the day-to-day. Yeah. You said you are sensitive to it is the word you used, sensitive to this type of feedback. I am as well. I think a lot of us are. How are you able to balance the two of I'm sensitive, but doggone it, it just keeps coming and coming and coming and coming. It's just this onslaught at some point.
I think I'm very fortunate to have an amazing family, and my wife's astonishing, and I always seem to attract the right people to support me. So if we go a bit to my trial, which was absolutely evil, it was too terrible. and what went with it, I just knew I had to get through it. And there were moments of deep depression there, and as you can imagine. Yeah. And there was a bit of post-traumatic stress disorder. But I knew I just had to get through it because I knew I was telling the truth, and these people were not telling the truth. So I think the fact that I'm a runner helps, because you know what pain and discomfort is, and you know you have to hang on. Right. And you know it's a marathon. You know, I run the Comrades Marathon, which is 90 kilometers, yes. And you know, from 65 kilometers, from 45 miles to the end is hell, and you just got to hang in there and keep going. I think that's the attitude. I'm not going to let these people win. I'm going to outlast them.
We had Bart Yasso on the show actually last year sometime, and he said that was his, of all, I mean, you know, Bart, of all the races he's done in the entire world, that was the one that he looks at as the greatest race for him, as far as enjoying the process and experience and all that. It is incredible.
It's a very special race. Yeah.
Yes. So let's just run through these. Let's start with hyponatremia in marathon in 1985. Really controversial, and talk about critique. You had the whole industry, the Gatorade type folks out there. It turned out to be a critical insight that people are like, are you kidding me? Of course. But can you kind of walk us through that journey? Explain why you've referred to the hydration science as bogus, basically. Just talk us through that, because I think a lot of folks have no idea, even now, you know, how many years later, 35 years later, the same message is kind of out there. So really important we get this out. Walk us through the journey and what you discovered and what it means today.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I started marathon running, we weren't allowed to drink much during the races. And so I was one of the first people pushing for more fluids to be available. And I was quite vocal about that in South Africa. And in fact, in March 1981, I wrote an article saying that you must drink as much as you can during your marathons. This is 1981. And what you can't drink, you throw over you to cool yourself. Come June the 1st, 1981, so it's 2 months later, I receive a letter from a lady who's run the Comrades Marathon. And she tells me that she went unconscious in the race and that she was unconscious for 4 days. And she gives me the whole story, and her sodium was very low. And she said, why was my sodium so low? And I said, I have no idea. It's never been reported before. So then I went and made calculations and looked into it, and I couldn't work out what the cause was, but it didn't seem to me that it was sodium loss in sweat. It didn't seem to me. It seemed to me there was something else. And then I found another 3 cases, and 1 or 2 of them I knew had drunk to excess. One of them was a lady who I had anorexia nervosa. So I knew that she weighed herself fastidiously. And she said, you know, in the Ironman, I put on 4 kilograms. And I said, it's not possible to put on 4 kilograms. She said, I did. And I said, okay. And then there was another guy who said, you know, I got this condition. I just couldn't stop urinating the whole night. I was passing urine all night. So anyway, then we made some calculations, and it became very clear to me that it was water intoxication. So we wrote a paper of that in 1985. And that was the paper you're referring to. And then what happened next was I was phoned the night of the Comrades, literally at 12 o'clock, midnight. The race is being held in another state. And I receive a phone call from the lady who's looking after the runners who come into the hospital. She says, Doc, I've got this, in the unit, intensive unit, it's full of patients who've got low sodiums. What do I do? I said, I don't know, but just don't give them fluid. That's all you do. Don't give them fluid. See if they can pass urine. And so I decided next year we would have to do some studies. So we did studies the next year, and we looked at those people who'd been hospitalized, and we showed that they're all fluid overloaded by between 2 and 6 liters. So one of the guys passed 6 liters. I'm not quite sure how many pints that is, but it's a huge amount. That's 6 kilograms of extra weight. That's 12 pounds of extra weight that he was carrying. And then I knew it was fluid overload. And so then we'd actually proved, but now just to come back, I got into medicine 1968. And 1969, a very famous paper written by 2 South Africans comes out in the South African Medical Journal saying the dangers of an inadequate water intake in marathon runners. Now, these are 2 iconic scientists, exercise scientists in South Africa, and they're saying the dangers of too little water and dehydration will kill you. And that statement would be used by Gatorade and the American College of Sports Medicine as the basis for their argument. So then I said, well, why don't we go and see if this is true? Let's weigh people before and after marathons and see how much weight they've lost and see if the weight loss predicts their temperature. And it never did. So then I knew that that was false. And there was one other thing that happened. There were two other things. I was the doctor at the South African cross-country championships, were held just in spring. And it was an incredibly hot day. And these guys were running 12 kilometers. And I had 3 cases of heat stroke. The first 3 runners came over the line and collapsed with heat stroke. And 12 kilometers, how can you become dehydrated in 12 kilometers?
Right.
So then I knew it's the rate at which they were running. And so that was the other side of the story. I knew that in people doing long distances, they could overdrink. But in short distances, your problem was you running too fast. That would cause heat problems. And so that became the basis for my beliefs. And again, it was 2 anecdotes. And I just had to see the anecdote to be able to interpret it, because my mind was ready. If you couldn't explain it this way, then that way is not right. You have to be able to explain it. And so I've always looked for paradoxes. And these were paradoxes because they weren't meant to happen. In the comrades, you're meant to collapse from exhaustion, from dehydration. And in the short distance race, how can you get heat stroke? Because you can't get dehydrated enough.
And yet, so this was 91-ish.
Mm.
And yet we're now 29 years later, and I'm not sure the message is out there. I mean, it is if you really dig in, but what has anything changed? Have you made other discoveries over the last, let's say, 5-10 years where you say, well, actually in this situation, can you give us the update for the marathoners, the Ironman folks, the endurance athletes, the ultra runners, just some general guidance for those folks?
No, I think the argument is always to drink to thirst. And as long as you do that, and people have never realized that in a marathon, you don't want to carry excess weight. So to lose weight is actually benefit. And that's why it's so difficult in science to prove it, because we can't do a study on the treadmill. It's not the same as running out of doors. And because you've got to carry your weight if you're running out of doors. And that's what the benefit of losing weight is. There must be a huge benefit of losing 5 kilograms in a marathon. The last 5Ks must be a lot easier if you're 5 kilograms lighter. And then you've got to look at, okay, is there a physiological failure, or because you're dehydrated? But no one's ever been able to show that. So the point is, we can never prove it that gaining or losing weight is going to be beneficial in the real world of Olympic competition. You have to listen to the experts and see what they're doing. And the experts I speak to, the guys who win races, say the fluid don't really make much difference. And when you watch the Tour de France and you see the guys throwing their bottles away at the bottom of the Alpe d'Huez, that tells you they know 500 grams of water in their drink bottle is too much, and the same on their bodies.
All right. So next domino to fall, 96, thanks to your research, muscle fatigue. You found that muscle fatigue is, and I'm quoting here, purely an emotional state made up by the brain, leading to the central governor theory that many people have heard about. Fascinating. When I did my PhD work, that was one of the things I loved digging into. How can you walk us through it first? And then how can it be utilized by athletes to enhance their training?
Okay, so this was another dogma that when we, fortunately, I started sports science in South Africa with nothing. I had nothing. We had a thermometer and a
I read that story. I love that.
People. And we had
you had to borrow the thermometer, it seems like.
Yeah, a thermometer. And we had a treadmill that got tired at 8 kilometers an hour. So that's all we had. So it's very difficult to do research when you don't have any facilities. Eventually, we got an oxygen analyzer, but it was the old type where you had to make the calculations yourself, not the computer ones that print out everything. And so you have to work from the basics. And so we were told in those days that when you exercise at an increasing intensity, oxygen consumption rises, and then it reaches a plateau. It doesn't go any higher. And that's the VO2 max. And when you reach the VO2 max, your muscles are anaerobic. And so we're using this archaic equipment. We were looking for this thing, this plateau. Couldn't find it. And the problem in those days was if you did a study of elite athletes and you wanted to say what their VO2 max was, you had to say that they plateaued, that each of them had plateaued. Otherwise, it's, oh, it wasn't a maximum test, you see. So you had a choice. You either said they plateaued or you said we couldn't get a plateau, and you told the truth. And I said, we tell the truth. We didn't get a plateau. And so we eventually got papers published in that way. And then I began to realize if you couldn't find a plateau, then it can't be an oxygen deficiency, because that's exactly what this says. So if you're not stopping because there's not an oxygen deficiency, why are you stopping? So then I came up with this wrong hypothesis that something was happening to the chemicals in the muscles, and that was causing the problem, independent of oxygen deficiency. So it could be the lactate was poisoning the muscles. So I came up with that theory. And then I gave a talk at the 1996 American College of Sports Medicine. And there I started talking about that there was something that wasn't working in the muscles. They weren't being properly regulated. And so that there was some sort of peripheral fatigue was the main factor. And I said, but it's not oxygen deficiency. But I didn't know what it was, and I didn't have a concept of how the brain was involved. Then 2 Americans wrote the standard critique of that article saying, it's an oxygen deficiency and so on. And then I went back and read the original Hill hypothesis about what was going on. And there it said to the effect that when you reach your maximum, the heart becomes ischemic. That's essentially what he said. The heart's not getting enough blood supply, and it tells the brain to stop recruiting the muscles. That was kind of the story. And I realized that's not the way it would work. It wouldn't come through the heart. It would be a whole bunch of information coming back to the brain, and the brain would say, okay, I'm not going to recruit muscles. Because to run faster, you have to activate or recruit more muscle. And that's the key. The scientists were saying to run faster, you must use more oxygen. No. To move faster, you must recruit more muscle, and then you need the oxygen. But the oxygen can't drive the muscles firing and recruitment. So then that was the central governor. It was very simple, that the brain is regulating the mass of muscle that you're recruiting. So when you get tired, and you can't go faster, it's because the brain says, we've got to slow down for whatever reason. There's some threat to homeostasis. So that was that hypothesis, and it was so simple to prove, because we just proved that when you do a maximal effort and you think that you're giving everything you can, you still only activated 50% of your muscle fibers. So you've got 50% remaining. Why don't you recruit them? Because it'll kill you if you did, or you'll tear the muscles or the bones or something. So it was very easy to prove that it's true.
And so on the practical side, how can an athlete listening to this and saying, well, wait a minute, so I've still got more when my brain's telling me, my body's telling me, you got to stop. I actually do have a little extra. I don't have, I mean, the concepts I understand about central governor is, back when we were hunter-gatherers, if you didn't have that kick in, you don't get home. Like, you're stuck out there with this deer. So now there's an aid station, 45 yards up the road. We know that. We know it's coming. Is there a way then to override that in any way?
Yeah, what we've advanced the central governor quite a lot. Andreas Venhorst, who was my PhD student and has just written the next iteration of the central governor. And he's a really interesting guy because he was a world-class triathlete, and he's a medical doctor, and he's a brilliant scientist, and his wife is a psychologist. So he's got an incredible background. So
what a bad combo.
He decided to come to Cape Town because he'd read about the central governor. And he said, when I went to my races, international races, I would look at the list of people who were competing, and I'd say, well, that guy's Olympic champion. I can't beat him. This guy's that. And I can beat the sixth guy, so I'm going to finish sixth, you see. And he said he would finish sixth every time. Wow. And he told himself, and he said until one day, he was convinced he was going to finish sixth. And with 20 kilometers to go in the run on the marathon and the Ironman, he suddenly discovered that he passed the guy who was lying fifth. So now he's lying fifth. And then he suddenly was fourth, and then he was third, and then he was leading. And he said it was the easiest race he ever had in his life. He said the last 10 kilometers, it was the easiest thing. And he suddenly realized there's something else going on here.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he looked at the psychological literature and he said, how do you cope with like pain issues if you're chronically ill and so on? And he said, the model that he developed and which he proved this to be the truth. And his PhD is downloadable on the internet, by the way. He said, 3 things happen when you're exercising. The first is that you feel the sensations from your muscles and your heart and everything. And that's information, and that sets the kind of the sensations of effort that you're putting in. And we all know about that. And when you start the effort, it's easy because you interpret it easy and you don't have any issues.
Sure.
Somewhere along the way, you start to get an emotional response to these. And you can think of you running a marathon. Initially, the sensation you're running 4 minutes a K or 3 minutes a K, whatever, the sensation is easy to cope with. You don't even notice it. But then halfway through the race, there's something happens and you start to get an emotional relationship to those feelings. And the question is, how do you feel? How do you respond? And what you notice is all the great athletes are actually, they become energized by it and they're emotionally positive. And what he showed in our experiments that those people who fall behind, the emotions become negative. And the moment your emotions become negative, your physiology changes. And you feel more discomfort. And you have reason now to start questioning why you're doing it. And then the third thing that happens is the stopping wish. And you now decide, is it worth continuing or not? And that's the so-called hitting the wall. We used to talk about hitting the wall because you run out of glycogen. It's not that at all. What happens is you say, if I run the next 10 Ks, it's going to hurt a lot. Is it worth it? And the winner says, of course it's worth it. I came here to do this. That's why I'm here. But the guy who's coming second says, no, actually coming second is good enough. So that's how the governor theory has helped. And I think what you have to realize is that this fatigue is an emotion that's generated by you and it's specific to you. It's not the guy next to you. It's having completely different relationship to his fatigue. And so that's very important. So you can overcome your fatigue. He might not be able to, or vice versa. Then you cannot avoid negative emotions. Any negative emotions and you've finished. And then finally the stopping wish, that's when it's over. And so that's what we try to say, that you've got to learn to control yourself, control your emotions, and you've got to understand why you're doing it. Because that's what comes, the stopping wish is all about, why am I doing this? Is the gold medal what I want, or is the silver medal good enough? And if the silver medal is good enough, that's all you'll ever get. The great example is John Landy, who ran the mile in 4 minutes and 2 seconds 7 times, leading up to till Bannister breaks it. And Bannister breaks it. And Landy in that period says, I've done it 7 times. I don't believe I will ever run a sub 4 minute mile. Bannister does it, and then Landy does it within 48 days or something. Yeah. So and he ran 4 seconds faster, a second a lap faster. That had nothing to do with physiology. That was his mental attitude.
100%. 100%.
Yeah.
Okay, so as you're talking us through this, I'm hearing some potential application outside of sport. Yeah, it's great for the mile, it's great for the Ironman, but have you gone down that path? Have you had some chats about that? What about outside of sport? Because it sounds like there's some great application for any aspect that you're going through.
Yeah, no, I work with teams, and then we talk about what are the long-term goals, and you have to see yourselves as winners before you even start. That's the key. My best example was my son-in-law is a coach of a rugby team, and he coached our university rugby team, and they were put in a competition that was above their level. That's what they thought. And they were told, listen, you're going to come 8th in this competition in the first year, and you're going to be relegated to the second team next year, which would have been a disaster because it would have destroyed the sport at the university. And he came to me and he said, Prof, this is the situation. We're ranked number 8. If we don't do anything this season, we're going to be relegated, which is going to be a disaster. And he said, what do? I said, you better teach them to believe in themselves. And that's what we worked on. And I spoke to the team from day one. We worked on self-belief. And I said, you've got to see yourselves winning that trophy before you even go on the field, before you do your first training session. And in the end, they finished the first on the log, and they lost the final in the extra time. They lost the final, which was astonishing. And then eventually they went and won the competition. And then they won one year they won the competition by scoring the most points in the last 5 minutes. It was considered the greatest comeback in the history of rugby. So, but it was all about self-belief and seeing the outcome. And what happened in that final game was the team was completely destroyed. They were losing by 15 odd points with 5 minutes left. And the one player, we put on the reserve, we put all our reserves in because they needed to last chance. It wasn't to win the game, but they didn't know that. They thought they were being put on the game to win the game. And as they went on, the key player on the team called them together. And he said, listen, guys, I've had the premonition. We're going to win this game. But they had to score 3 touchdowns or 3 tries in 5 minutes. Now, it's much more difficult to score 3 touchdowns in 5 minutes than it is in football if you've got a good quarterback. It's a little more complex because there's so much time wastage and so on. And you can't stop the clock. So he says, we're going to win this game. You just got to believe it, you see. And so then we went and won the game. They scored the 3 touchdowns and they won the game. And before that, they'd scored 1 touchdown in 75 minutes. And then they scored 3 in 5 minutes. It was just astonishing. And that again was the belief systems. So we work very much on, you've got to see the outcome long before you even start. And I mean, I learned that from American football coaches. All the great coaches are just astonishing in the way they understood self-belief.
Yeah. Well, I'm seeing an application across any area of health and wellness. So your marriage, your school pursuits, if someone's wanting to decrease their BMI or their weight by 10 pounds, whatever it is, that same thing is it worth it? The emotional response, the early on, diet's easy to talk about, and we're going to get into that in a minute. But if you're starting off, you're like, yeah, no problem. I can make these changes. And then, 10 days in, 3 months in, you're like, I don't know if this is worth it. It seems to me, unless I'm hearing it wrong, the same concepts apply to any pursuit in life, relationships, food, exercise. It's not just racing. Am I hearing that right?
I think you're absolutely correct. Yeah, I talk to those people and I say, you've got to see yourself 20 kilograms or 40 pounds lighter. You have to see yourself as that and the clothes you're going to be wearing. Because if you don't see that, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, that vision.
So I quite agree with you. You have to see that vision. You have to have that vision.
So let's talk about Lewis Gordon Pugh in 2005. Extreme cold swimmer. He could raise his core body temp before entering the water, and I think you coined it anticipatory thermogenesis. Was this developed, or was it something genetic that he had that you don't have or I don't have? What was this?
Yeah, I think in retrospect, it's probably something that some people can do. The Tibetan monks, they talk about the Tibetan monks being able to warm if you put a wet blanket on them at night, they will be able to warm it and raise their body temperature. So I think clearly it's not unique to him. But what he did was he was able to raise his temperature about 1 degree as he thought about the swim in the cold water. And that degree was absolutely crucial because that gave him about 10 more minutes in the cold water. And we had to expose him in the cold water for 20 minutes. And that extra 10 minutes was just made it a lot safer. Yeah. He might not have made it if he couldn't raise his temperature beforehand. And I remember the swim at the North Pole. So I'd have to go and put the thermometer in and all these sorts of things. And he was undressed, and the temperature was probably 3 or 4 degrees. This is outside. This is not in the water. The water was 0 or below water. I said it was minus 1.8. But outside, he was sweating. He was actively sweating before he got in the water. So, I mean, that just shows astonishing, something strange happening there.
Well, I think I do the opposite with cold. I'm like, oh, the pool's going to be so cold today. And I probably reduce my body temperature before I even get in. Were there certain strategies he used? Was it self-talk? Was it, I don't know. Was there anything practical that you can share with us that maybe we could try with that or some other area?
Well, he's unique in the British because he got into the special forces in the United Kingdom on his 3rd effort. So he failed twice. And on the 3rd one, he got it right. And he was in action. And he said that he could, before you go into military action, you have to prepare yourself mentally. And he said he used the same sort of techniques in the swim. So, whatever they taught in the military, that's what he was using before his swim.
Interesting. All right. Let's jump into your current controversial one. High fat, low carb, your book, Real Meal Revolution. Can you give us a high level overview and then we'll dig into it a little bit more?
Sure. So here's this guy who's written the law of running, which says you must eat as much carbohydrate as you possibly can because that's good for your health and makes you run faster. So December the 12th, 2010, okay. I've just finished writing Waterlog and I sent it off to the publishers. And it's a massive tome. The book that was actually published was only 60% of what I sent.
Is that right?
The other 40%, they said you'll be in jail if we publish this.
Okay, well, we're glad you're not calling from jail today.
That's it. So I sent the book off and I hadn't run in it. You know, you talked about the frustrations. That had been 30 years and all the frustration I had to deal with. So I was so glad to release it. And then in the middle of the night, I woke up. My brain said, you must go for a run tomorrow morning and you mustn't stop running because I hadn't been running enough. So I went and I had the worst run of my life. And there's a little hill outside our house. And I came to the top and I used to be a really good hill runner. And I reached the top. And I felt like I was at the top of Mount Everest. My heart rate was through the roof and I was exhausted. So I got home and I said, you know, I'm overweight by about 20 kilograms. I can't run. I'm getting old. How am I going to sort this problem out? Because I'm too old to run 100 miles a week. I can't do that to lose weight. Because that's the only way I could ever control my weight. Because I'm insulin resistant, eating a high carb diet, I had to run 90, 100 miles a week. Then I would get to the lightest weight. But at the minute I stopped, my weight would just shoot up. So anyway, I get home and I open my emails and there's an advert for a book. And it just so happens I've got that book right here. So the book advert says, lose 6 pounds in 6 weeks without hunger. This book actually says lose up to 15 pounds in 2 weeks. But it doesn't say without hunger. When I saw the without hunger, I said, this is ridiculous. You can't lose weight without hunger. I said, who said this? And then I read Eric Westman, Steve Finney, and Jeff Volek. I said, but they're good scientists. How can they say this? This is quackery. This is a disgrace. And who are they linked to? Atkins. He tried to kill us. He told us to eat saturated fat. And I spent 33 years trying to get people off their fat. So I say, this is such a disgrace. I'm going to go and read the book. So I drive down, buy the book, and this is the copy. And I open it. And after 3 hours, I said, oh my gosh, I got it wrong for 33 years. And there was a statement in here. And then I went and looked at the publications. You know, I've even underlined them, I noticed. I've underlined these things. I said, but I don't know any of these studies. How can they be true? And then I realized they were true because they published here in the Nutrition and Metabolism in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. I said, they can't be frauds. They must be telling us right. So I said, okay, 3 hours, that's my last carb. So I converted to the low carbohydrate, high fat diet. And within a day, I felt better. And instead of losing 6 pounds in 6 weeks, I lost 11 pounds in 6 weeks. And so then within 6 weeks, my running went back 20 years. Literally, I was running at 60, I was running as fast as I was at 40. It was like a miracle. I mean, it was astonishing. And so that was, I then realized that there's something happening here and that was important. But I didn't tell anyone, but they saw because I'd lost 20 kilograms, 40 pounds weight. They said, what did you do? You got cancer. Then there's a question. So I said, no, I haven't got cancer. I'm eating the Atkins diet. The Atkins diet, what are you, mad? You're going to die. You've got arteries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So eventually I had to write about it. And then I got nailed. Then my profession went after me. I lost all my funding. And then eventually I was charged with telling people to eat a diet that was going to kill them. And so we went through that. Yeah.
Well, the natural question comes to my mind, and maybe for some of the listeners too, because I know you're tracking this, you know, your blood levels, the lipids, all those kinds of things that people would be like, well, no, that'll cause my LDLs to go through the roof. Walk us through that side of the equation, just for folks that might be having that natural question.
So what happened was I then went on the diet, and then I noticed my fasting glucose was elevated, and it was in the diabetic range. And I'm not someone who likes to do things and measure things that are bad. I want to measure good things. I know that's my nature. So I left it for about a year. And then I was fully tested for screened for diabetes, and clearly I had type 2 diabetes. So then I spoke to people I trusted in the low carb community, and they said, you need to go into metformin, which I did. And I strengthened up my diet. In other words, I cut the carbs even to below 25 grams. And then I was able to put myself into remission. I got all my glucose values beautifully in the normal range. So I was able to put my type 2 diabetes in remission. And then I began to realize, reading this, that diabetes is the killer. If you get heart disease, it's diabetic heart disease. We never say that. We say you can have diabetic nerve damage, diabetic neuropathy. Mm-hmm. You can have kidney failure to diabetes, diabetic nephropathy, but you can't have diabetes heart disease. No, that's cholesterol. Cholesterol's got nothing to do with it. And how do we know that? Because if you lower your cholesterol, you almost make no difference to your heart attack risk. If something is causal and you treat the cause, the disease must disappear. That's the definition of cause. So if you lower your cholesterol to the range that we're told is normal, and you do not reverse diabetes, you don't prevent heart disease, cholesterol is not the cause. That is the definition of cause. But unfortunately, epidemiology has kind of weakened what cause is, because it's associated with what's called causal. The cause of heart disease is type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, high glucose, high insulin. That's what causes heart disease. Now, my values are in the normal range. So therefore, I don't worry. My cholesterol is beautifully elevated. My LDL cholesterol is fantastic. And at my age 70, the higher it is, the longer you live. So that's a paradox that I could never understand. Why up to 65 is cholesterol a risk factor, but after 65, it's a risk factor for shortened life? So it's all nonsense. It's diabetes that is causing arterial disease, and all my values are the best they can be. So, of course, I'm going to die of something, but the beauty is I should be dead now, because my dad had diabetes for 10 years and died. And it's the worst possible death. I've had my diabetes for 10 years at least, because I know the diagnosis for 10 years. But there's a period where I wasn't diagnosed. It could have been 2 or 3 years. Sure. And so far, I don't have any obvious symptoms of type 2 diabetes or the signs of illness. So I've done pretty well for 10 years. It's not going to last forever. That I understand. But at least when I do, or if I get the conditions, whatever they are, I'll say, well, for 10 years, I had a fantastic life. I had a very high quality life, and I did the best I could. But some things you can't reverse.
So how about for athletes? It seems to me, I remember you and Dave Scott have done some work together, different recommendations for somebody that is, Dave's not training right now because of his injury, but somebody who's training 3, 4, 5 hours a day, different recommendations, or have you explored that path at all?
Yeah, no, Dave, really interesting, because Dave read my book, The Real Meal Revolution. And when he saw it, he realized that perhaps his more vegetarian plant-based diet wasn't ideal. And he converted. And he said that the changes were miraculous. And this is in his 60s, in his late 50s.
Early 60s.
Yeah, early 60s. And he said, I will never prescribe a low-fat diet to an athlete doing the training that I was doing. And he said that he could have done with some of the mental benefits of this diet when he was winning 6 Ironman. He said it was tough. There were days when it was tough. And he said that he believes those tough days might have been helped if he'd been eating a high-fat diet. What interests me was Mark Allen was eating a much higher protein and fat diet and was only eating 30% carbs when he was training. So he was partially adapted to a higher fat diet. And you could always, what always interests me about Mark Allen, he was so well defined. His muscles were so well defined. He didn't have much subcutaneous fat. And I couldn't understand. He looked different than the other athletes.
He did.
But the best example is the one that makes me laugh, is Paula Newby-Fraser. Now, Paula is from South Africa, and she went over, and I knew her very well. And she helped us in various things, because I helped the team in a race called the London to Paris Triathlon, where, can you believe it, this was a triathlon event where they ran from London to Dover, then they swam the English Channel in relay, and then they cycled to Paris. And she happened to be watching the race and following it, and By then, she was the top triathlete in South Africa. And she got the right to go to the Ironman. And I think she came third in her first Ironman. And she was still hardly trained. She then went to America and she started training really hard. And she phoned me. She says, Tim, I'm exhausted. I said, Paula, you're overtraining. Go back and do less, and so on, which she did. But the key was she phoned me because she'd read something that Steve Finney, who's one of the authors of this book, he did a study in 1984 and showed that a high-fat diet wasn't bad for you. He didn't say it was better than a high-carb diet. And she phoned me and she said, Tim, do you think I should add more fat to my diet? I said, Paula, in an Ironman, it makes sense. So here I am telling everyone else to eat a high carbohydrate diet, and I tell her to eat more fat. And she interprets that she should stop eating carbs, literally. And she goes on a high-fat, low-carb diet and wins 28 Ironman and 8 at Kona, 8 champions. When she retired, she came to me and she said, Tim, the most important single piece of advice I ever got in my career was what you told me. And I said, but Paula, I never
didn't really say that.
I never said that. So anyway, we laugh a lot about that one. So that convinced me that certainly for the Ironman, it makes sense to be fat adapted. And Dave Scott, who's got more experience than him? You can't do away with that experience. And it's funny that he and Mark Allen are both realized that they needed more fat and more protein in the diets.
So still incredibly controversial. I mean, there's not I was going to say a day that goes by. There's not 10 seconds that goes by. Why is it? Is it just that our bodies are so unique that this might be better for this person, this might be better for this person, that we can't, as a scientific community, come down on this is the answer? Because for every great argument that we have on this side, we have seemingly equal over here. Can you help us figure that out? Think that through.
What I can tell you is the evidence on the other side is nowhere as strong as the evidence on our side. That I can promise you. But it doesn't get a fair hearing. And then I'll tell you why it doesn't get a fair hearing. And the person who really presented this argument is Gary Taubes, who just by chance I have his fantastic book, which was so influential to me, Good Calories, Bad Calories. But he's just written a book, The Case for Keto. And he describes it absolutely. And I discussed this with him. And the way he puts it in The Case for Keto, it just comes through absolutely clearly. And the problem is that there are 2 types of humans. And there are only 2. You either can eat all the food you like of whatever nature and you don't get fat, or you eat the certain foods and you will get fat. And we're the fat and easilies. And I'm a fat and easily, and so is Gary. And so is Nina Teicholz. And so is everyone who's ever written a book. And so I guess Eric Westman and Steve Finney. Jeff Volek was always lean. But I would guess that Eric Westman and Steve Finney were also slightly overweight. And they discovered that the only way to control our weight is to eat a low carbohydrate diet. Now, if, as Gary Taubes argues, you're a researcher and you're thin, and you are researching and you will conclude that anyone can eat the diet that you eat and they should stay thin. And the only reason you stay thin is because you're disciplined and you're not gluttonous and you do lots of exercise. And that's why you're thin. The fact that your biology could be totally different and unique compared to the people who fatten easily doesn't cross your mind. And so whenever you see a fat person, as I was, you see Noakes' problem. He's just lazy and he's gluttonous. The fact that I was running 100 miles a week or whatever doesn't quite enter the equation. And that's the problem. You will find that 99% of the people promote the low carbohydrate diet from a scientific point of view or as a treatment were fat once upon a time. And we lost weight and we realized it. And the people arguing the other way are thin people, and they've been genetically thin, and they've never had to address the problem of how do I lose weight, because they've never had to lose weight. And that's the divide. The problem is industry sort of helps these people, the people who have no problem with weight, and they get all the funding, and the low carb people, we just ostracized.
There's so much I want to. I'm watching the clock because I really appreciate you taking the time with us here. Let's hit 2 more. If you were to start the journey over, if you were to look back, I think you turned 72 this year, right?
Yeah.
If you were to look back and say, I'm going to recreate the journey, what would you do differently that you could have tweaked?
Yeah, I think I would have probably done a few other sports than just running. I think that I would have liked to have gotten to CrossFit earlier because I'm now into CrossFit.
Okay.
I think that, I would have liked to be a good swimmer, and I would have liked to do more triathlons. I think that they're more safe on your body, perhaps, than just running. From a scientific point of view, I think, I couldn't have done anything differently. And I'm very happy. And the reason why I perhaps was successful, because I was in South Africa. And I could do my own thing. And that, whereas I don't think I would have been able to do my own thing in other places, I would have been isolated perhaps. And people just didn't pay. When I was doing the conventional low carb, high carb diets, everyone was happy with me. No one complained. And they gave me all these awards and all the funding I needed. And so it was growing fantastically. But as soon as I found the truth, of course, then it changed. No, I don't think I would have changed it. I perhaps would have liked to change the environment. I think, being a doctor it's a great training, but it's a dreadful profession. And I think the profession's falling apart because they're not addressing the real truth. They're not addressing the fact that diet's so important. But what I get great pleasure when I speak to young doctors and they say, Dr. Noakes, you saved my career. I can now cure patients, and that really makes me happy. So I think that I would have liked to be able to influence the profession more and get them to accept that this diet's critically important for the health of large proportion of the population. But otherwise, no, I've had a lovely time. I've had a great time. And even the trial was dreadful. It was awful. But I wouldn't change it for one thing, because I learned so much from it and I met so many good people. And I think in the end, people will look back in 20 years' time and say that was a very important part of the low carb movement. That trial was very important.
Yeah. All right, last one, just advice for those people that say, I want to go out on a limb. I want to be like Professor Noakes. I want to, send this message or speak this way at a conference or whatever, but I'm just getting so much pushback. What guidance would you give that person who wants to be that a shining star, that difference maker, but they're just feeling so much pressure from everyone around them?
Yeah, that's a great question, because what's happening is bullying, and that's a difficult one. And my son is actually researching the bullying that I went through, particularly on social media, and looking at this issue. And unfortunately, bullying is very, very prevalent in academia. And so you have to have the strength to realize that what you're saying is much more important than what's happening to you. And you have to understand that you're not the problem, that these people are the problem. And that doesn't help often. You just have to have the courage that in the end, the truth has to be exposed. If you honestly believe that what you're doing is exposing the truth, and you can provide that evidence, you must just keep going. Because in the end, you'll be sorry, I'm going to say vilified. You will be vilified. But in the end, you will be proven to be correct. And in the end, the truth will come. The truth will be exposed. It just takes 20, 30, 40 years. And you may not be around when it comes, but you made that contribution. When you think about Atkins, who what he was saying was absolutely true, and he was completely vilified. John Yudkin, who promoted the problems of sugar, who exposed them in the 1970s, who was completely vilified, lost all his funding. Today, we know he was correct. So that's the price of it. You just have to go with it and believe in it, and just keep doing it. But find people who support you, because you need a core of people to support you. And I've got that core of people, and the low carb group is remarkable in the way they support each of us. So, but you have to have it in the family as well. My greatest friend now is the man who defended me in my trial, Dr. Rocky Ramdas from Pietermaritzburg, who, this is a lovely story. And this is interesting how these things happen. He had a case in Pietermaritzburg where 8 people died in a running race, a running event that was organized by the Department of Transport, because they had, in South Africa, many people are unemployed. They advertised they needed 90 new policemen or something to that effect. But they had 90,000 applications, 90,000 applications. So they said, well, we'd have to put these 90,000 people to run 5 kilometers. They must be able to run 5 kilometers. 8 people died in that 5-kilometer race. And so Rocky knew that I'd written Waterlogged. And he approached me and said, would you help defend these people in this case? And so he saw something in me that he really liked. And then when I was charged, because I just trusted him so much, I phoned him. I said, Rocky, I'm in trouble. I need your help. He said, Tim, everything for free. And we had 4 amazing years during the trial. And we had so much fun. And despite all the problems and the pain and the discomfort that I was suffering, we built this incredible friendship, which will last all my life. And so those are the things that happen on the journey. The journey has to be difficult, you know. When you run the Comrades Marathon, you finish it and you say, I'll never run it again. The next day you're back in training. And this is the same. You know, in the moment, in the trial, in the moment, it's horrid, it's terrible. But when it's done, you say, gosh, I wouldn't have not gone through it. It was just so worthwhile.
Professor Noakes, this was such a privilege. Really appreciate it. Susanna and I hope to at some point get down to South Africa, get a chance to sit down with you, have a cup of coffee. But thanks for taking this time today. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, because it's like been a 1-minute interview. It's been a fabulous interview. You're a brilliant, brilliant interviewer.
Thank you
and
so
thank
much.
you. I've enjoyed every minute of it, and I hope you will get to Cape Town, then I can show you everything that.
We'll go run that hill you talked about.
That's right. If I'm still able.
You'll be there. You'll be there.
Fantastic. Thanks so much.
Take care.
Thanks.